A number of years ago, I was sitting at my desk agonizing over the annual so-called stewardship sermon. I say I was agonizing not because I didn't believe in the good work of the congregation I served, or because I had any misgivings about the generosity of the congregation, but simply because I have sat through enough dreadful sermons on stewardship in my life to consider that something of a dirty word. I didn't want to add one more to that pile. Thinking to be helpful, the treasurer of the congregation quipped to me, "Oh, don't worry about it. Their minds are already made up before they come to the church, and besides which, there are no erasers on pew pencils." And you know, that's true. I actually hadn't noticed it before then, but the little golf pencils that many congregations put in their pew racks don't actually have erasers on them. I went into the sanctuary this week and looked in our pews, and I see that we are particularly confident we have provided ballpoint pens for your usage. But I looked my treasurer levelly in the eye and said, well, maybe they can't erase their pledge, but they can add zeros. Ministers, you probably picked up, have a certain number of jocular anecdotes that we use to prime the pump on Stewardship Sunday, so to speak. A story is told of Gene Milner, who was for many years the pastor of the Second Presbyterian Church in Indianapolis. He was asked by the leadership of his congregation to preach to the congregation about stewardship. So, on the day appointed for this message, he climbed into the pulpit, addressed the congregation, and said, "The session has asked me to speak to you about money. I consider the matter handled." And of course, generations of ministers have glibly informed their congregations, "I have good news for you and bad news for you." The good news, of course, is that the church has every penny we need to fund our ministries and beyond for the year to come. The bad news is it's all still in your bank accounts. You're going to hear these jokes again, by the way. I'm just going to warn you up front. They will make a periodic recurrence. But truthfully, as institutions that survive on donations go, the institutional church has through the years done rather well. In my experience, it is because church members want to be generous. Folks want to know how their money is spent, I suspect because they have given enough to care how it is spent. So much so have I found this to be the case through the years that about 10 years ago I decided that I was no longer going to preach stewardship sermons on Stewardship Sundays. The way I see it, if we have done our job as a congregation in talking plainly about what God has done for us and what God needs from us, by the time we actually ask you to sit down and make a deliberate practice of filling out your pledge card for the year to come, you're already equipped. All that is left is to engage in the faith practice of giving. So with that as my rubric and my method, you can imagine my chagrin when I looked at the lectionary for today and found there the text that is commonly referred to as that of the widow's mite. You know how the story goes. You just heard it. The widow drops the dead level last bit she has in the plate, and Jesus praises her in the sight of everyone, in the hearing of everyone who will listen. I've always been profoundly uncomfortable with this text. Probably I am uncomfortable with it because I am aware of situations where slick fundraising apparatuses prey on the elderly and the poor. I far prefer the difficult texts from Ruth for today. Ruth is such a lovely story. Why don't we concentrate on Ruth instead today? How about it? The way this goes down is that Naomi moves with her husband Elimelech to Moab. Now, for a Jewish audience listening to this story, they would have already known that the story has significantly gone off the rails the minute they move to Moab. Moving to Moab isn't something you do if you have other options. You only go across the border to Moab if what is behind you is scarier than what is in front of you. But anyway, they've gone to Moab because people are starving to death in the place where they live. And there's a bit of foreshadowing in the very introduction when we learn that Naomi's two sons are named Mahlon and Chilion. These names mean weak and sickly. It's sort of the opposite of naming your children Thor or Magnus or Walker and Texas Ranger. But anyway, weak and sickly find themselves Moabite wives, which in the eyes of their family is just about the worst thing that could have happened. And before the first paragraph break, all three men are dead. Naomi is left with her two daughter-in-laws flat busted in the land of Moab. No children, no grandchildren. This is not good. This is also the point where we begin to realize that the book of Ruth is neither sweet nor G-rated, because it is our first encounter with the Hebrew practice of levirate marriage. Put simply, levirate marriage is all about the men. If a man died childless, it was the responsibility of his next of kin to ensure that his widow had an offspring in his name. It didn't really matter if his brother or cousin was already married to someone else or even remotely attracted to the widow or she to him. It was the custom. It was what was done to ensure that the memory of the man would live on in his offspring and that the dead man would have an heir to inherit his property. The only benefit the widow got was to have a son to care for her in her old age. Naomi's husband and both of her sons have died. She's stranded in a foreign land without family. It's no exaggeration to say that she is flat busted in Moab. Now, knowing that there is no male next of kin to marry her daughters-in-law and make sure they had offspring, Naomi attempts to release both of them. "Go back to your mother's house," she said. And there's a world wrapped up in that sentence. She doesn't say, "Go back to your father's house." Their fathers have already done everything they are going to do for their daughters. Whatever dowries were available to be paid have been paid. In a subsistence economy, there is no way that they could secure a second spouse for their daughters. So Naomi, knowing all of this, says, "Go back to your mother's house. Go back to your mother's house, and there, in exchange for mucking out the stable or doing whatever menial tasks are available, you will find a safe place to sleep, perhaps a meal from time to time, and you will at least avoid being dragged into another profession." Naomi is ready to take off for home, and her daughter-in-law Orpah resigns herself to her faith and returns to live in her mother's house with all that that means. But Ruth says no. She'll take her chances on Naomi. She will take her chances on Naomi's God. She will go back to Israel as a foreign woman with all that that implies and let the chips fall where they may. I have to guess that what was behind her was scarier than what was in front of her. When they get back to Israel, Ruth has to earn a living, so she goes gleaning. There's a rule in the Bible that says the rich people don't get to keep everything they earn or grow. It's in Leviticus, in the 23rd chapter. So Ruth goes out to the fields of a rich man named Boaz to glean whatever harvest is left around the edges of the field, because Boaz, as a good Jewish man, has observed the law. He has not harvested all the way to the edge of his fields. When she goes, she catches the eye of the rich man. One interpreter says he was long in the tooth, but he still knew a pretty girl when he saw one. Boaz tells the harvesters not to treat Ruth badly, which is, of course, code language for not treating her as though she's in that other profession. When the end of the day comes, Boaz observes Ruth's basket, and finding it not as full as he would like, he pours an extra measure of grain into it. When she asks why he is doing this, he says, I have heard what you have done for Naomi. Now, Ruth might be oblivious to what is really going on, but Naomi is decidedly not. So when the end of the harvest comes and the party is to be had at the threshing floor as they work through their harvest, Naomi tells Ruth to wear her good clothes. This is the point in the story where the Bible employs numerous euphemisms. You can find out what they are in the footnotes, but I'll just brush over them by saying, if this were a movie, this is the point where the solo saxophone starts playing. As Frederick Buechner puts it, Ruth followed her mother-in-law's advice to the letter, and it worked like a charm. Boaz was so overwhelmed that he'd pay attention to an old crock like him when there were so many young bucks running around in tight-fitting jeans that he fell for her hook, line, and sinker. And to make a short story even shorter, after Boaz's lawyers get Elimelech's will through probate, the way is clear for Ruth and Boaz to be married, and they live happily ever after. At least that's the version of the story that the Bible tells. It's really only in the last lines of Ruth that we see why a story that is at the very least a little seamy at the edges is such an important part of the Bible. Ruth and Boaz, of course, have a son named Obed. Naomi becomes Obed's wet nurse. They usually go racing past this point when we are interpreting the story. We go straight to the point where we learn that Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David, and of course David is the greatest king of Israel, and Ruth is his great-grandmother. But that's not really the important bit, now is it? There are plenty of stories about David in the Bible. Why bother including a tell-all biography about his great-grandmother? No, I think the most important line in the book is this one. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin. May his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Inherent in those words is the acknowledgement that not one blessing comes into our lives which God does not make to happen for us and for our benefits. Naomi was flat, busted, and without a reason for hope in the world. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow, indeed. Of course, David knew that too. He knew about abundance and all the ways that God blesses us for the purpose of blessing the world. He knew about gratitude. That's the sort of gratitude that underpins the story of the widow and her 2 coins. In her book, Help thanks, wow, the three essential prayers. Anne Lamott writes, Father Gregory Boyle, the Jesuit who founded Homeboy Industries, a program that helps former gang members re-enter society, reminds us that gratitude is not about waving our arms in praise on Christian TV shows. She says, that's what we think God wants, because we would love to have a few hundred people applauding us, waving their arms around like palm fronds. Instead, God's idea of a good time is seeing us pick up litter. God would love to see us serving food at the soup kitchen at Glide Memorial Church, or hear us calling our meth head cousin just to check in because nobody else in the family will speak to him. He can be long-winded and a handful, but we used to eat each other's peas and put them in the glasses of root beer at the holiday dinner, so we have a history together. With two other cousins, we took naps together in one big bed, so we pick up the 200-pound phone and dial his number and say, "How are you?" I really believe God's idea of a good time is also to see us sharing what we have worked so hard to have, or to see us flirting with the old guy in line at the health food store, telling him our grandfather had a hat just like his, even though she says it's a lie. What we're talking about is a life of authentic gratitude. The story of the widow and her 2 coins in the context of Mark's gospel stands in stark contrast to the rest of the 12th chapter of Mark, where Jesus is being constantly challenged by Pharisees and scribes. They've quizzed him on money and taxes. They've tried to back him into a corner on the law and which commandment is the greatest. They have been sparring verbally around the practices of faith, and along comes this widow, this poor widow, and she exhibits exactly the type of trust in God that Jesus has been preaching about. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees, they knew exactly how much they were required to give. There's a long history of interpretation they could draw on. That, too, is in Leviticus and in Numbers and in Deuteronomy. According to the law, to the history of giving, she could have kept one of the coins. It still would have been generosity beyond measure to give half of what you have to live on. But that's not the point. Lamar Williamson writes, "The woman's action is praiseworthy because out of her poverty and without reservation, she gave her whole being to God." But more is meant here. Her gift foreshadows the one that Jesus is about to make, his very life. In Mark, the poor widow becomes the type of him who, though he was rich, yet for our sakes became poor, so that by his poverty we might become rich. All of life, every bit of it, every scrap and all abundance is a gift from God. That's why at the end of the day, these really aren't stewardship texts, these stories from Ruth and Mark. They're really not even stories about money or the lack of it. They are stories about faith, and they are stories about gratitude. They are stories of the ways that God is always redeeming, even when we can only see it at the end of the story. And there are stories about how you and I can break out of the ordinary and the predictable and perhaps even the time-worn practices of our lives to find new meaning, new refreshment for our faith. There really are stories about gratitude. God is always working for redemption, kindness, love, grace, and mercy. In grateful response, let us do likewise.